The ledger didn't belong in the basement of the Maritime Archive. It wasn't bound in the standard vellum of the 19th century port authorities, nor did it carry the familiar stamp of the East India Company. It sat beneath a layer of dust so thick it felt like felt, tucked behind a row of water-damaged shipping manifests from the 1840s. When I first pulled it from the shelf, the weight was wrong. It was too heavy for its size, the cover constructed from a dense, dark leather that resisted the humidity of the London docks. I opened it to find a map that should not exist. Not a map of territories, but a map of currents. It depicted trade routes that bypassed every known colonial hub of the era. No stop in Cape Town, no refueling in Singapore. These were direct, deep water lines connecting the Pacific Northwest to the heart of Central Asia, bypassing the British blockade entirely. Ask yourself why a merchant would risk the open ocean without the protection of the Royal Navy. What if the protection they relied on wasn't British? What if the power that guaranteed their safety has been scrubbed from every textbook we own? I began to scan the entries. The dates were clear, yet the ports of origin were redacted with a precision that bordered on the surgical. Not ink spills, not age, erasure. Institutional erasure designed to hide a global network of commerce that functioned outside the grip of the emerging central banks. The ink was a deep violet, a pigment that shouldn't have been commercially available in 1845. I traced the handwriting, a sharp, rhythmic script that spoke of a culture of high literacy and extreme administrative efficiency. This wasn't the work of a rogue trader. This was the record of an empire. The more I looked, the more the anomalies began to stack. I found references to the Grand Exchange, a term that appears in no official economic history of the period. According to these records, the exchange handled tonnages of steel and refined minerals that dwarfed the output of the Ruhr Valley or the American North. But where did this steel go? Not to the railroads of the West, not to the steamships of the Atlantic. It went east, into the vast, supposedly empty spaces of the Siberian interior and the American Great Basin. We are told these areas were wilderness, populated by nomadic tribes and unexplored by civilized man until the mid-19th century. The shipping records tell a different story. They speak of massive load distributions, of heavy machinery being moved into the mountains of Utah and the plains of Tartaria decades before the first official surveyor arrived. Look at the architecture that remains. Look at the star forts that dot the globe from Vladivostok to Florida. They tell us these were defensive fortifications built by colonial powers. But look at the load distribution. Look at the geometry. These aren't forts. They are nodes. They are part of a global energy and logistics grid that the current historical narrative cannot account for. Why do we find the same red brick, the same arched windows, and the same copper domes in San Francisco as we do in Moscow? It isn't a coincidence of style. It is a signature of a single, unified civilization. A civilization that traded in a currency we no longer recognize and utilized a technology we are told hadn't been invented yet. What if the history we are taught is merely a layer of paint over a much older, much more complex structure? I spent weeks tracking the movement of a single ship mentioned in the violet ink ledger, the Borealis. According to the London Port Authority, the Borealis was a small schooner that sank in a storm in 1849, but the ledger shows it arriving in San Francisco in 1851, carrying a cargo of atmospheric conductors. In 1851, San Francisco was supposedly a chaotic tent city filled with gold miners. Yet, if you look at the photographs from that era, the rare early daguerreotypes, you see a city of stone. You see wide boulevards and massive Greco-Roman edifices that look centuries old. You see a city that was found, not built. The shipping record suggests that the gold rush was a cover story. It was a salvage operation. Thousands of people were moved into the area not to find gold in the hills, but to occupy and repurpose the infrastructure of a fallen world. The Borealis wasn't bringing supplies to miners, it was bringing parts to reactivate the grid. Not coal, not wood. Something else. The records mention mercury refinement and vibratory calibration. These are not the concerns of a frontier town. These are the concerns of a high-tech society undergoing a forced transition. I began to see the pattern everywhere. In the archives of the Smithsonian, in the basements of the Vatican, and in the forgotten libraries of St. Petersburg, the same dates keep appearing. 1848, 1849, 1850. The years of the Great Unrest. We are told these were years of political revolution across Europe. But what if the revolutions were a distraction, a global smokescreen to hide the final dismantling of the Tartarian trade network? While the public watched the barricades in Paris, the institutional gatekeepers were burning the maps. They were renaming the cities. They were rewriting the manifests. The shipping records from the Baltic show hundreds of vessels departing for terra incognita and never returning. Or rather, returning under new names, with new flags and new histories. It was a total reset. The steel from the Grand Exchange was melted down. The atmospheric conductors were stripped of their copper and labelled as ornamental spires. The truth was hidden in plain sight, disguised as the progress of the Industrial Revolution. We are taught that the 19th century was a time of unprecedented invention. What if it was actually a time of unprecedented theft? What if the inventors, like Edison and Tesla, were merely the ones who figured out how to patent the remnants of a lost global system? Consider the scale of the erasure. To remove an entire global empire from the collective memory requires more than just burning books. It requires the restructuring of time itself. It requires the creation of a Middle Ages to fill the gap, a Renaissance to explain the sudden reappearance of advanced knowledge, and an age of discovery to justify the colonial takeover of pre-existing ports. The shipping records I found in London were a leak in the dam. They showed the overlap, the moment when the old world was still functioning while the new world was being installed. I found a manifest for a fleet of ironclads departing from the Caspian Sea in 1842. According to our history, ironclads didn't exist until the American Civil War 20 years later. These ships were destined for the Mississippi River. Ask yourself, who were they planning to fight? And why, when they arrived, did they find a land already filled with star forts and ancient canals? The records describe the clearing of the waterways, a euphemism for the destruction of the old Tartarian maritime infrastructure. They weren't building the Erie Canal, they were digging it out. The deeper I went, the more the air in the archives felt heavy. I started to notice I was being watched, not by people in the shadows, but by the institutions themselves. Every time I requested a specific volume of maritime law from the mid-1800s, it was undergoing restoration. Every time I tried to access the digital records of the Dutch East India Company's final years, the server would fail. There is a perimeter around this information. It is a soft wall, built of bureaucracy and expert consensus. They tell us that Tartaria was just a name on a map, a vague term used by ignorant cartographers to describe the vastness of northern Asia. But if it was just a name, why did the United States government issue a classified memo in the 1950s ordering the removal of all references to Tartaria from historical textbooks. Why does the Russian state today treat the archaeology of the steppes as a matter of national security? It's because the shipping records don't just prove trade, they prove a different way of living. They prove a world without the scarcity that drives our modern economy. They prove that energy was once free and that the ocean was a highway for everyone, not a private pond for the few. I tracked a shipment of luminous glass from the port of Odessa to the city of Chicago in 1870. This was just months before the Great Fire. Chicago, we are told, was a wooden city that burned to the ground because of a cow and a lantern. But the shipping records tell of a city built of stone and iron, a city that was receiving advanced technology from across the world. The fire wasn't an accident, it was a demolition. It was a way to clear the old world architecture that couldn't be explained away. After the fire, they built the White City for the World's Fair, a collection of massive, beautiful buildings that they claimed were temporary structures made of plaster. But look at the photos. Look at the shadows. Those weren't plaster. They were the original stone structures of the Tartarian era, temporarily reclaimed for the fair, before being systematically destroyed or hidden behind new facades. The shipping records prove the materials for these buildings were already there. They weren't imported for the fair. They were being shipped out of the city as rubble, while the elite celebrated the birth of a new era. The logistics of this deception are staggering. It requires a level of coordination that transcends borders and generations. It suggests that the people who run our world today are the direct descendants of the ones who orchestrated the Great Reset. They are the looters of a golden age. They moved into the palaces, they took over the ports, and they told us we were lucky to have them. They turned the atmospheric conductors into church steeples and told us to pray instead of power our homes. They took the global trade routes of the Tartarians and turned them into the restricted lanes of the modern shipping conglomerates. Every time you pay an electric bill, every time you pay a toll at a bridge, you are paying a tax to the people who stole the world. The shipping records are the evidence of that theft. They are the receipts for a civilization that was bought for nothing and sold back to us as progress. I found one final entry in the violet ink ledger. It was dated December 1852. It wasn't a cargo list. It was a directive. The transition is complete, it read. The memory of the Great Exchange is to be phased out. All remaining vessels are to be scuttled or repainted. The names of the northern ports are to be stricken from the charts. From this point forward, the history of the world begins with us. It was signed with a symbol I had seen before, a stylized compass and square, but with an extra line that turned it into a key that locks the past. I realized then that I wasn't just looking at history. I was looking at a crime scene, a crime that is still being committed every day that we believe the lies they've told us. The urban explorers who find the impossible tunnels under our cities, the researchers who find the out-of-place artifacts in the coal mines, we are all looking at the same thing. We are looking at the remnants of a world that was more connected, more advanced, and more free than the one we live in now. Ask yourself, what would happen if the world knew? What would happen if we realized that the pioneers weren't settling a new world, but scavenging an old one? The power of the institutional gatekeepers relies entirely on our ignorance. They need us to believe that we started from nothing, that we struggled through the mud until they gave us the steam engine and the light bulb. But the shipping records prove otherwise. They prove that we were already there. we were already trading across the oceans. We were already building cities of light. The somber truth is that we are a species with amnesia, living in the ruins of our own greatness. The mystery of Tartaria isn't about a lost country in Asia. It's about a lost identity for all of humanity. As I closed the ledger and slipped it back into the shadows of the archive, I knew that the investigation was only beginning. The patterns are there. The evidence is carved in stone and written in violet ink. We just have to be willing to see it. What if the door to the past isn't locked? What if it's just waiting for us to turn the key? The silence in the archive was no longer empty. It was pressurized. I felt the weight of the missing centuries pressing against the ribcage of the building. To understand the global reach of the Tartarian network, one must look at the specific gravity of the materials they moved. In 1853, a series of manifests appeared in the port of New Orleans for a substance labelled only as red: mercury. Modern science tells us this is a myth, a Cold War hoax, or a simple compound of no extraordinary value. But the shipping records describe a storage protocol that defies 19th century logic. These containers were lead-lined, suspended in gimbals to prevent vibration, and accompanied by resonance technicians rather than sailors. Not coal miners, not stevedores. Something else. The destination for these shipments wasn't the burgeoning factories of the north, it was the star forts along the Gulf Coast. Ask yourself why a military fortification would require thousands of gallons of a rare mineral compound. What if the fort wasn't a defense against ships, but a capacitor for the atmospheric energy grid? The load distribution in these structures suggests they were designed to handle internal pressures that no cannon fire could produce. I tracked the red mercury back to the Altai Mountains. The records there are even more fragmented, hidden behind the Cyrillic revisions of the Soviet era. But the pattern remains: massive excavations that the locals called the veins of the earth. These weren't mines in the sense of digging for raw ore, they were extraction points for a pre-existing infrastructure. The shipping records from the inland ports of the Ob River show a constant flow of refined materials moving toward the Arctic Circle. We are taught the Arctic was an impassable wasteland until the age of nuclear icebreakers. Yet, the 1840 manifests speak of open water corridors and thermal beacons maintained by the Tartarian Admiralty. It suggests a climate that was fundamentally different, or a technology that could manipulate the environment on a planetary scale. If they could keep the northern routes open, they controlled the shortest path between the continents. They held the keys to the world's movement. Institutional gatekeeping has rebranded this period as a little ice age, a convenient natural phenomenon to explain why the northern cities were suddenly abandoned and encased in permafrost. Consider the mud flood phenomenon through the lens of these logistics. All across the world, from Moscow to Melbourne, we see the same architectural anomaly. Grand buildings with their first floors buried deep underground, their windows half submerged in the earth. The official narrative calls them light wells or architectural flourishes. But the shipping records from the years immediately following these burials tell a darker story. They speak of silt management on a scale that suggests a global cataclysm, followed by a massive, coordinated effort to dig out only the most vital infrastructure. The records show the redistribution of found populations. Displaced people moved by the thousands to occupy these half-buried cities. These weren't immigrants seeking a new life. They were colonial subjects being moved into the shells of a superior civilization. They were given new names, new histories, and told that their ancestors had built the very walls they were now scrubbing clean of soot and salt? What if the great exhibitions and world's fairs of the late 1800s were actually inventory fairs? Look at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. The White City was filled with massive statues, electric lights, and moving walkways. We are told it was all temporary, built of staff, a mixture of plaster and hemp. But the shipping records for the demolition phase are missing. There is no record of thousands of tons of plaster being moved out of the city. There are, however, records of heavy masonry being repurposed for federal buildings and private estates of the elite. The fair wasn't a celebration of the future, it was a liquidation sale of the past. The public was invited to marvel at the inventions of the new era, while behind the scenes, the true technology, the free energy collectors, the wireless transmitters, the atmospheric harvesters, was being dismantled and hidden away. The gatekeepers took the tech and gave the people the light bulb. They took the symphony and gave us the phonograph. I found a ledger in an estate sale in Virginia that belonged to a mid-level clerk for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. It contained a list of non-standard track gauges encountered during the westward expansion. The clerk noted that in many places the tracks were already there. They weren't laying new rail, they were adjusting the width of existing iron paths to fit the new, inferior locomotives of the industrial age. The Tartarian rail system was wider, designed for massive loads and high speeds that our current physics struggles to reconcile. The shipping records confirm this. They mention land ships capable of crossing the steppes in days, not weeks. The erasure trope is most evident here. The old tracks were ripped up, melted down, and rebranded as the triumph of the transcontinental railroad. We are told the pioneers conquered the wilderness. In reality, they were just following the scars of a fallen giant. The institutional erasure extends to the very maps we use today. If you look at a map from the late 1700s, Tartaria is a sprawling empire, larger than Russia and China combined. By the 1850s, it begins to shrink, fragmented into independent territories that were conveniently swallowed up by the rising colonial powers. The shipping records show the transition of these ports from Tartarian administration to British, French, or American control. It wasn't a series of wars. It was a foreclosure, a global bankruptcy triggered by a weaponized financial system. The new central banks issued debt to a civilization that had lived without it, then moved in to seize the assets when the interest couldn't be paid in a currency they didn't recognize. It was the ultimate hostile takeover. The shipping manifests show the wealth of a world being funneled into a few private vaults in London and New York. Ask yourself why the history of the 19th century is so filled with accidental fires. London, 1834. New York, 1835. Chicago, 1871. Boston, 1872. Seattle, 1889. Every major port city with Tartarian infrastructure suffered a catastrophic fire that conveniently destroyed the municipal archives and the oldest stone buildings. What if these weren't accidents? What if they were tactical strikes to erase the physical evidence of the previous administration? The shipping records for the reconstruction of these cities often show the arrival of materials before the fires even started. They knew the fires were coming because they were the ones lighting the matches. The Great Fire was a tool of urban renewal, a way to clear the old world and install the new, controlled environment. The stone was replaced with brick, the copper with tin, and the truth with a fable of resilience. I began to investigate the orphan trains. Between 1854 and 1929, an estimated 250,000 children were shipped from the coastal cities of the United States to the rural interior. The official story is that these were the children of poor immigrants being sent to good homes, but the scale and the logistics don't match the narrative. Where did all these children come from? Why were there so many orphans at the exact moment the old world was being reset? The shipping records for these trains describe the cargo as human capital and re-education units. What if these children weren't orphans at all? What if they were the survivors of the found populations, the children of the civilization that had been erased? By separating them from their parents and their history, the gatekeepers ensured that the next generation would have no memory of the world that came before. They were a blank slate, ready to be programmed with the new history of the self-made man. The rhythmic, staccato pulse of the steam engine became the heartbeat of the new world. It was a slower, louder, and more expensive heart. The shipping records from the late 1800s show a massive increase in the transport of coal and oil, substances that were barely mentioned in the earlier Tartarian ledgers. The transition from atmospheric energy to fossil fuels was the final nail in the coffin. It created a world of scarcity. It made energy a commodity that could be metered, taxed, and cut off. It turned the citizens of a global empire into the customers of a corporate state. Not this freedom, not that abundance, something else, a controlled, measured existence. The violet ink records are a ghost of what we lost. They speak of a time when the world was wide and the energy was as free as the air. As I sit in this dimly lit room, surrounded by photocopies of redacted manifests and maps of forgotten routes, I feel the gaze of the censors. They are still here, hiding in the footnotes of academic journals and the restricted sections of the great libraries. They want us to stay in the loop, to keep asking the same approved questions, but the evidence is too large to hide. Forever. The stones of the star forts are screaming. The buried windows of our cities are watching. The shipping records are the trail of breadcrumbs leading out of the dark. We are the investigators now. We are the ones who must look at the red brick and the copper domes and see them for what they truly are. Not monuments to a dead past, but blueprints for a stolen future. Ask yourself, if the history they gave us is a lie, what else are they hiding? What if the Great Reset has happened before, and what if it's happening again? The loop is not yet closed. The investigation continues. The architectural footprint of the post-reset world is a study in structural gaslighting. To understand the scale of the erasure, one must look at the specific load distribution of the so-called post offices and customs houses erected between 1870 and 1890. I spent months cross-referencing the shipping manifests of heavy granite blocks arriving in coastal cities with the actual volume of stone present in the finished structures. The math does not resolve. The manifests account for barely 30% of the material. Not a clerical error, not a loss at sea, something else. The buildings were already there, their foundations reaching deep into the pre-flood strata, and the new stone was merely a cosmetic skin applied to hide the original Tartarian geometry. Ask yourself why a fledgling republic in the midst of civil unrest would prioritize the construction of massive Greco-Roman temples to house local bureaucrats. What if these weren't new builds, but refacings designed to claim ownership of a pre-existing power grid? The shipping records describe the arrival of cladding kits and facade anchors, terms that imply a superficial application rather than foundational masonry. We are told the pioneers built these monuments with hand tools and horse-drawn carts. Look at the precision of the joinery. Look at the weight of the lintels. the institutional gatekeeping, insists on a narrative of primitive struggle, yet the physical evidence speaks of a high-energy industrial capability that had no business existing in the horse and buggy era. The transition from the old maritime law to the new law of the sea provides the legal framework for this theft. In the 1850s, the violet ink ledgers show a sudden shift in how cargo was categorized. It was no longer common wealth or universal resource. It became salvage. By reclassifying the entire infrastructure of the Tartarian trade network as abandoned salvage, the emerging Central Powers created a legal loophole that allowed them to seize every port, every canal, and every atmospheric harvester on the planet. The shipping records from the Mediterranean show hundreds of salvage commissions departing from London and Paris to claim the coastal cities of North Africa and the Levant. They weren't colonizing empty land. They were moving into fully functional, high-tech hubs that had been temporarily silenced by the environmental cataclysm of the 1840s. The records describe the clearing of the silt and the reactivation of the conduits. They were literal scavengers, picking through the bones of a giant and calling themselves architects. Ask yourself, if you found a city of gold, would you tell the world you built it, or would you admit you stole it? The erasure trope was a necessity for their legitimacy. They had to kill the memory of the previous owners to justify their own status as the new lords of the earth. I followed the trail of atmospheric aeons to the salt mines of Poland and the American Southwest. The shipping records from the 1860s show a massive global movement of refined salt and conductive minerals. These weren't for food preservation. They were being moved to the basements of the great cathedrals and state capitals. The manifests mention grounding arrays and static accumulators, not religious icons, not civic decor. Something else. When you look at the cross-section of a 19th century cathedral, you aren't looking at a place of worship. You are looking at a power plant. The rose windows are frequency filters. The spires are antennas. The pipe organs are acoustic resonators designed to vibrate at the specific frequency of the local ley lines. The shipping records prove that these components were being manufactured in a centralized industrial hub, likely located in the untouched heart of the Siberian Tartary, and shipped worldwide long after the official fall of the empire. The gatekeepers eventually cut off the supply chain, leading to the Great Dark of the late 19th century, a period we are told was a transition to the electric bulb, but was actually the final flickering out of the free energy grid. What if the Great Migration was actually a forced relocation of the surviving Tartarian labour force? I found a series of shipping manifests from the 1880s detailing the transport of specialised artificers from the interior of Eurasia to the industrial centres of the West. These men and women were not listed by name, but by skill set: dome riveters, mercury distillers, resonance tuners. They were the last keepers of the old technology, pressed into service by the new regimes to help stabilize the hijacked infrastructure. The records show they were kept in industrial colonies, many of which were later rebranded as the notorious slums of New York and Chicago. Once their knowledge had been extracted and documented by the patent offices, they were disappeared from the records. Not death, not deportation. Erasure. The patents for the new inventions of the 19th century, the telegraph, the motor, the turbine, almost all trace back to these specific years and these specific locations. The inventors we celebrate were merely the stenographers of a dying civilization's secrets. The rhythmic, staccato cadence of the new history began to drown out the echoes of the old. Every museum founded in the late 1800s served as a vault for the forbidden artifacts. I tracked a shipment of obsidian lenses from a port in the Pacific Northwest to the Smithsonian Institution in 1891. These lenses were described as being capable of magnifying the celestial light to a degree that renders the stars visible in midday. According to our science, this is impossible. The lenses never went on display. They were logged into the permanent archive and never seen again. The shipping records for these types of anomalies are always the same: arrival, inspection by a government agent, and then a total blackout. The institutional gatekeepers are not just hiding the past, they are hoarding the present. They are keeping the advanced tools of the Tartarians for themselves, using them to maintain a level of surveillance and control that the public cannot imagine. We are living in a low-tech reservation, while the heirs of the Great Reset operate in a world of light and shadow just beyond our perception. Consider the contrast of scale between the world we are told existed and the world the shipping records reveal. We are told the 1800s were a time of wooden ships and iron men. But the manifests describe vessels of composite material that resisted rust and barnacles, ships that could travel from Liverpool to New York in 3 days without the use of coal or wind. They were called vapor runners. They didn't leave behind a trail of smoke, they left a trail of ionized air. The records show these ships were systematically rounded up and destroyed between 1855 and 1865. The golden age of sail was a forced regression, a way to slow down the world and bring it back under the control of the coal and oil barons. The gatekeepers traded the speed of light for the speed of fire. They traded the freedom of the currents for the chains of the refueling station. Not progress, not evolution. Something else. A managed decline designed to keep the population tethered to a centralized supply chain. I found a map tucked into a base 1874 shipping log that showed the Antarctic rim not as a frozen wasteland, but as a series of gated checkpoints. The records speak of the Southern Exchange, a trade route that led through the ice to land masses that do not appear on any modern globe. We are told that Antarctica was first sighted in 1820 and remained unexplored for a century. The shipping records tell of a regular postal service to the outer territories that operated until 1895. What if the Earth is not a closed system? What if the global trade of the Tartarians was actually an intercontinental exchange that stretched far beyond the limits of our current maps? The erasure of Tartaria was the first step in the erasure of our true geography. By shrinking our history, they shrunk our world. They put us in a cage of continents and told us there was nowhere else to go. The shipping records are the proof that the cage was built recently, and the door is still there, hidden behind a wall of institutional lies. The more I investigate, the more the unresolved philosophical open loop begins to haunt my sleep. If they could erase an entire global empire in less than 50 years, what are they erasing now? We live in a world of digital records and cloud storage, systems that are even more fragile and more easily manipulated than the violet ink ledgers of the 19th century. We are told that we are at the end of history, that we have reached the pinnacle of a human achievement. But the shipping records remind us that we have been here before. We have been a global, high-tech, unified civilization before, and it was taken from us, not by a natural disaster, not by an alien invasion, but by a group of men who decided that power was more important than truth. They are the architects of the silence. They are the masters of the reset, and they are still in charge. I tracked the final shipment of the Grand Exchange to a nameless warehouse in the Nevada desert. The manifest was dated 1902. It was a collection of history modules, physical records of the Tartarian era, preserved in vacuum-sealed copper canisters. They were meant to be a time capsule, a way for future generations to rediscover the truth. But the Salvage Commission got there first. The records were classified, the warehouse was scrubbed from the maps, and the technicians were given new identities. The loop was closed. Or so they thought. But they forgot about the violet ink. They forgot about the ledger in the London basement. They forgot that the truth has a frequency, and that once you start to vibrate at that frequency, the lies begin to shatter. The shipping records are not just paper and ink. They are a resonance. They are a call to wake up. Ask yourself, why do you feel a sense of loss when you look at the old world buildings? Why does the modern world feel so thin, so temporary, so fake? It's because your DNA remembers. It remembers the Grand Exchange. It remembers the cities of light. It remembers the time when the oceans were open and the energy was free. The institutional gatekeepers can burn the books and rename the cities, but they cannot erase the resonance of the truth. We are the investigators. We are the ones who look at the shipping records and see the ghost of a world that was ours. And what if that world isn't dead? What if it's just waiting? What if the Funt Great Reset was not an end, but a pause? The investigation is not over. It is only shifting to a new phase. The patterns are everywhere. The evidence is in your hands. What will you do with the forbidden knowledge? Will you close the ledger, or will you follow the route to the edge of the world? The staccato rhythm of the investigation leads us to the final, most unsettling realization. The erasure wasn't just about the past, it was about the future. By removing the evidence of a free energy, decentralized society, the gatekeepers ensured that we could never imagine an alternative to their system of control. They stole our imagination. They made us believe that the Industrial Revolution was the only way forward, that the information age is the peak of our potential, but the shipping records show a different path. They show a world where technology and nature were in harmony, where commerce was a tool for connection rather than exploitation. Not this reality, not that dream, something else. A hidden potential that still exists beneath the layer of institutional paint. The violet ink is still wet. The ships are still waiting in the mist. Ask yourself, what happens when the tide turns? What if the next great reset is ours? In the quiet corners of the world's archives, the truth still breathes. I found a final entry in a manifest from 1912, hidden in the back of a ledger for a transatlantic steamer. It was a single line written in the same sharp, rhythmic script of the old world. The currents are shifting, the grid is silent, but the resonance remains. Look to the red stone, look to the copper. We are still here. It wasn't a message from the past, it was a message for the present. The Tartarian trade network was never truly destroyed. It was only driven underground into the shadows of the very institutions that sought to erase it. They are using our history to power their world, while we use their lies to navigate ours. But the shipping records are the key. They are the map back to the truth. And once you have the map, the cage no longer exists. The loop is open. The investigation is yours. What if the history of the world doesn't begin with them? What if it ends with us? The air in the archive is cold now, the dust settling back onto the shelves like snow. The ledger is back in its place, hidden behind the mundane records of a fake history. But the information has been transferred. The pattern has been recognized. The institutional gatekeepers can keep their restored volumes and their classified files. They cannot stop the signal. They cannot stop the resonance. The shipping records prove that Tartaria traded worldwide, but they also prove something much more dangerous, that we were once great and that we can be great again. The erasure trope has failed. The truth is a load distribution that the modern world cannot support. It is too heavy. It is too real. It is coming for the foundations of their lies. Ask yourself one last time, who are you and where did you really come from? What if the answer is written in violet ink on a page they told you was blank? I think about the silt management records one last time. They spent decades digging out the world, washing away the mud to reveal the structures they would later claim to have built. They were the original urban explorers, but instead of flashlights, they brought armies. Instead of cameras, they brought sensors. They were so afraid of the world they found that they spent 2 centuries trying to bury it again under a mountain of paperwork and academic consensus. But the shipping records are the one thing they couldn't fully account for. The sheer logistics of a global empire are too vast to be entirely contained. There is always a manifest left behind. There is always a ledger in a basement. There is always a witness. And today, that witness is you. The investigation is not a story, it is a choice. You can believe the narrative, or you can look at the load distribution. You can follow the flag, or you can follow the trade routes. The violet ink is waiting. The ships are ready to sail. What if the world you see is just a shadow of the world that is? What if the truth is the only thing that's real? The somber, rhythmic pulse of the investigation fades, leaving only the sound of your own heartbeat. It is the same heartbeat that drove the resonance technicians of the old world. It is the same heartbeat that fueled the grand exchange. We are the descendants of a civilization that spanned the stars and the oceans, a civilization that was erased but never forgotten. The shipping records are our inheritance. They are the proof that we belong to something much larger than the small, petty history they have given us. Not this life, not that role, something else. A global identity, a universal connection. The gatekeepers are watching, but they are also afraid. They know that once we see the pattern, their power vanishes. They know that the truth is a tide that cannot be held back. The loop is open, the investigation is ongoing, the next step is yours. Consider the institutional erasure as a form of architectural scarring. Every time they tore down a World's Fair building or renovated a state house, they were trying to heal a wound in their narrative. But the scars remain. They remain in the impossible tunnels beneath our feet. They remain in the anachronistic artifacts in our museums. They remain in the shipping records that they forgot to burn. These records are the DNA of our true history, the blueprint for a world that was stolen and hidden in plain sight. We are the investigators, the urban explorers of the mind, picking through the ruins of a global empire, to find the seeds of our own liberation. The skeptical tone of the modern age is our shield, but our inquisitive spirit is our weapon. We will not be satisfied with their expert opinions. We will not be silenced by their bureaucracy. We will find the violet ink. We will follow the red mercury. We will unlock the Southern Exchange. The investigation into the shipping records that prove Tartaria traded worldwide is not just a journey into the past. It is a journey into the nature of power itself. It reveals how easily the truth can be manipulated and how much effort is required to keep it hidden. But it also reveals the resilience of the truth. Like the stone of the star forts, the truth is patient. It can wait centuries for someone with the right eyes to see it. It can wait for an investigator who is willing to look past the institutional gatekeeping and see the global pattern. The records are there. The evidence is clear. The only question is whether you are ready to see it. Ask yourself, if the world was once a place of free energy and open borders, what does that mean for the world today? What if everything we are told is impossible was once the norm? What if the Great Reset is not a threat, but an opportunity to reclaim what was lost? I found one last document, a scrap of vellum caught in the binding of a 19th century maritime atlas. It was a list of coordinates for the silent ports. These were the hubs of the Tartarian network that were never found, never restored, and never repurposed. They are still out there, hidden by the ice, the desert, and the deep ocean. They are the repositories of the old world's knowledge, the vaults of the Grand Exchange. The shipping records show that several vessels were dispatched to these ports in the final days of the reset, carrying the most sensitive technology and the most important records. They are the unresolved philosophical open loop of our investigation. They are the proof that the story isn't over. The gatekeepers may have won the battle for our history, but they have not yet won the war for our future. The silent ports are waiting for us to find them. The shipping records are the first clue. As the investigative essayist of this revisionist documentary, I invite you to continue the search. Look at your own city with new eyes. Look at the red brick, the copper domes, and the half-buried windows. Look for the violet ink in the margins of your own history. The pattern is there, waiting for you to recognize it. The institutional erasure is failing, and the truth is beginning to bleed through the layers of paint. We are no longer alone in our skepticism. We are a global network of investigators, rediscovering our own history, one ledger at a time. The tension of the mysterious and the unsettling is the feeling of the truth. Breaking through. The forbidden knowledge is no longer forbidden. It is just waiting to be reclaimed. Ask yourself, what if the ships are already on their way back? What if the Grand Exchange is about to reopen? The next parts of the script are unwritten because they are the parts you will live. The investigation is yours. The rhythmic, staccato pulse of the world is changing. The atmospheric conductors are beginning to hum again. The vibratory calibration of the truth is starting to resonate with the people. The shipping records were just the beginning. They provided the evidence, the logistics, and the proof of the heist. But the recovery of the stolen world is a much larger task. It requires us to look past the institutional gatekeeping and the erasure trope, and see ourselves as the rightful heirs of the Tartarian legacy. We are the citizens of the Grand Exchange. We are the navigators of the southern routes. We are the keepers of the violet ink, the somber, mysterious. Tone of our investigation is turning into a provocative, intellectual challenge. We will not be managed. We will not be reset. We will remember. The loop is closing, but this time it is closing around the ones who tried to hide the truth. The investigation is complete, but the action is just beginning. What will you do when you see the ships on the horizon? What if the history they gave you was just a temporary anchor, and now it's time to set sail? The structural integrity of our modern amnesia depends entirely on the compartmentalization of the world's archives. If a researcher in London compares a manifest with a clerk in Buenos Aires, the facade crumbles. I began to look for the trans-Pacific ghost fleets mentioned in the suppressed diaries of mid-19th century whaling captains. These men, far from the reach of the central administrative hubs, saw things that the institutional gatekeepers spent the next century relabeling as optical illusions or atmospheric anomalies. The diaries speak of massive, silent vessels constructed of a shimmering, non-oxidizing alloy that moved against the wind at speeds that defied the physical limitations of sail or coal. These ships were not listed in any Lloyd's register. They didn't fly the Union Jack or the Tricolour. They flew a gold dragon on a field of violet. Ask yourself why the private journals of these captains were systematically bought up by historical preservation societies in the 1880s and placed in restricted vaults. What if the whaling industry was actually a maritime paramilitary force pocket-taced with the atmospheric containment of these rogue Tartarian traders? The shipping records hint at a global cleansing of the commons, where the open ocean was transformed from a shared highway into a series of strictly policed toll roads. The load distribution of the great lighthouses provides another puncture point in the narrative. We are told these were built by heroic engineers to protect shipping from the rocks. But look at the architecture of the Pharos-class towers built between 1840 and 1860. They possess a massive internal copper core and subterranean saltwater batteries that dwarf the power requirements of a simple oil lamp. The shipping records for these construction projects list mercury vapor resonators and Fresnel amplification arrays that were capable of projecting light and perhaps more hundreds of miles beyond the horizon. These weren't just beacons, they were the relay stations for a wireless communication and power network that spanned the Pacific. The records show these towers were decommissioned or modernized in the late 1800s, which usually meant the removal of the copper cores and the installation of inferior low wattage electrical systems. Not this efficiency, not that range, something else. A systematic downgrading of global infrastructure to ensure that no city could operate independently of the new centralized energy monopoly. The age of enlightenment was, in reality, the age of the Great Dimming. Consider the Siberian anomaly in the trade manifests. Throughout the 1840s, thousands of tons of refined grain and textiles were shipped into the Siberian interior from ports in California and Oregon. Our history tells us that Siberia was a frozen, sparsely populated penal colony at this time. Why would a penal colony need enough high-grade silk and winter wheat to feed a population of millions? What if the Wild West and the Wild East were actually the two ends of a highly developed transcontinental civilization that utilized the Bering Strait as a bridge rather than a barrier? The shipping records describe ice-breaking tenders that kept the Northern Passage open year-round, utilizing the very thermal beacons that the maritime archives now claim were myths. The erasure trope here is blatant. They renamed the cities, redrew the borders, and told us that the vast stone ruins found by the pioneers were merely natural rock formations or the work of lost tribes who possessed no written records. The violet ink ledgers prove the records existed. They prove a bureaucracy that was more sophisticated than anything in Washington or London. The institutional gatekeeping of the 20th century moved from burning books to reinterpreting technology. I found an 1862 manifest for a shipment of acoustic drills sent from the port of Sevastopol to the Himalayan foothills. Modern archaeology tells us that the great mountain tunnels of that era were carved by thousands of labourers with pickaxes and black powder. But the shipping records describe a vibratory excavation process that could liquefy granite in seconds. This technology was part of the Tartarian Grand Exchange Toolkit, a way to connect the world through the Earth itself, bypassing the turbulent surface oceans entirely. When the reset occurred, these drills were confiscated, and the tunnels were either collapsed or rebranded as natural caverns, and ancient catacombs. Ask yourself why so many modern high-speed rail lines follow the exact path of newly discovered ancient tunnel systems. What if we aren't building anything new? What if we are just clearing the silt from the veins of a previous superior world? The records of the tunnelling commissions are always classified as matters of national defence, a phrase that serves as the ultimate wall for the inquisitive investigator. The rhythmic staccato pulse of the Great Reset is most audible in the financial records of the 1870s. This was the era when the gold standard was forcibly imposed on the world. We are taught this was a move towards stability. In reality, it was a move toward capture. The Tartarian trade network operated on a resonance credit system, a decentralized form of value based on energy production and resource availability. It was a system that couldn't be manipulated by a central bank. To destroy Tartaria, the gatekeepers had to destroy its currency. The shipping records show a massive global movement of physical gold into the vaults of a few select families in Europe. This gold didn't come from mines, it came from the reclamation of Tartarian monuments. The copper domes were stripped, the gold leaf was scraped from the spires, and the sacred geometry of the old world was melted down into boring, uniform bars. The wealth of a civilization was turned into a shackle. The manifests for these bullion transports are the receipts for the theft of the planet's future. Not this prosperity, not that growth, something else. A debt-based illusion that requires constant expansion to prevent total collapse. I tracked a shipment of atmospheric harvesters that arrived in New York Harbor in 1881. These were listed as decorative statuary for the new skyscrapers being erected in the financial district. If you look at the antennas on top of the buildings from that era, they all possess the same specific geometry, a series of nested toroids and copper spheres that matched the diagrams in the violet ink ledgers. These weren't decorations, they were the power plants for the buildings. The shipping records show that for the first 10 years of their existence, these skyscrapers had no coal furnaces and no external electrical connections. They were self-powering. Then in the 1890s, the records show a massive retrofitting project. The harvesters were removed or grounded, and the buildings were connected to the new metered grid owned by the emerging utility titans. The antennas were left in place as ornamental spires to mock the people below. The institutional gatekeepers want us to believe that the history of electricity begins with Edison's flimsy filament. The shipping records prove that we were already living in a world of wireless atmospheric light. What if the Civil War in America was actually the final military campaign to break the Tartarian hold on the Mississippi Valley? The shipping. Records from the 1850s show the Southern Confederacy and the Northern Union were both receiving massive amounts of armaments from the same European banking houses, but the cargo being moved out of the South wasn't cotton. It was ancient heavy machinery and refined ores taken from the star forts of the Gulf Coast. The war was a massive salvage operation disguised as a political conflict. The destruction of the South allowed the gatekeepers to move in and clear the land of its original infrastructure, replacing the grand Tartarian estates with the plantation narrative that served the new economic order. The shipping manifests for the post-war reconstruction show a total lack of raw materials being brought in, yet thousands of miles of railroad and hundreds of new stone buildings appeared overnight. They didn't build them, they uncovered them. They stripped them of their technology and rebranded them as the New South. The erasure of the Tartarian maritime records was not just a bureaucratic task, it was a philosophical one. The gatekeepers had to change how we perceived our relationship with the earth. The old records speak of the living current, a concept that the ocean and the atmosphere were a single, conscious system that could be harmonized with. The new records speak of natural resources to be exploited and territories to be conquered. This shift in language is the ultimate tool of institutional erasure. By changing the words we use, they changed the world we see. I found a redacted memo from a 19th century geographic society that explicitly ordered the removal of all terms related to ethereal navigation from official charts. They replaced the ether with the vacuum, and in doing so, they turned a vibrant, energy-filled universe into a cold, empty void. They made us feel small, isolated, and dependent on their limited, fire-based technology. The shipping records are the evidence of our true potential, a record of a time when we moved in harmony with the pulses of the planet. The staccato rhythm of the investigation brings us to the Museum of the Reset. Every great national museum is a graveyard for Tartarian technology. I found a shipment log for the British Museum from 1878 that listed 12 orreries of the inner sun. These were mechanical models of a world that does not match our current globe, a world with more continents, more oceans, and a different celestial arrangement. The models were never put on display. They were labelled speculative clockwork and moved to a deep storage facility in the countryside. Ask yourself, why would a civilization build hyper-accurate models of a fake world? Or what if the world we live in now is the fake one, a simulation of a history created by the gatekeepers to hide the true nature of our realm? The shipping records prove that these objects were considered highly valuable, yet they have been erased from the public consciousness. We are allowed to see the primitive tools of the Stone Age, but the high-tech artifacts of the Tartarian era are kept under lock and key. The investigation is reaching a point of critical mass. The patterns are too frequent to be ignored. The evidence is too heavy to be suppressed. The shipping records that prove Tartaria traded worldwide are the cracks in the dam, and the water is starting to pour through. We are the ones standing in the flood, holding our lanterns high, looking for the truth in the rising tide. The institutional gatekeepers can try to patch the leaks with more lies and more official history, but the load distribution is against them. The weight of the truth is a physical force, and it is crushing the foundations of their control. The violet ink ledgers are the testament to a world that was and a world that will be again. Not this silence, not that ignorance, something else, a global awakening, a return to the grand exchange. The investigation is not an end, it is a beginning. The best step is to find the survivors, to find the ones who still remember the frequency of the old world. Ask yourself, what would you do if you found the key to the silent ports? What if the forbidden knowledge is not a burden but a compass? The shipping records have shown us the route. They have shown us the ports of origin and the destinations of the ghost fleets. They have shown us the true geography of our world and the true history of our species. The sombre, mysterious tone of the investigation has prepared us for the shock of the truth. We are no longer afraid of the dark because we know that the dark is just a place where the light has been turned off, and we know how to turn it back on. The atmospheric harvesters are still there, waiting on the rooftops. The red mercury is still waiting in the star forts. The violet ink is still waiting to be read. The investigation is an invitation to join the grand exchange, to become a trader in the truth, to become a navigator of the currents. The rhythmic staccato pulse of the script ends here, but the narrative continues in every stone of every city you walk through. The investigation is now your responsibility. You are the one who must look at the shipping records and see the ghost of the world. You are the one who must challenge the institutional gatekeepers and demand the truth. The erasure trope is only effective if we allow it to be. If we remember, the erasure fails. If we see the pattern, the deception is over. The somber truth is that they stole the world, but the provocative truth is that they couldn't hide the receipts. The shipping records are the proof. Tartaria traded worldwide, and the world belonged to everyone. It's time to reclaim our inheritance. It's time to reopen the ports. The loop is open. The investigation is yours.